So I talked myself into a little bit of trouble, and I want to clarify a few things here. So there was a recent tweet by Rachel Horn, which you can see here. If you don't know who Rachel Horn is, she's a well-respected medical journalist who also has multiple sclerosis, and she's fairly active on Twitter. And she posted this tweet of an old video I made in 2019 where I reviewed the book, The Wahls Protocol. As many people here already know, the Wahls Protocol is probably the most famous and popular book about multiple sclerosis of all time. It's written by Dr. Terry Wahls, who herself is a physician who has multiple sclerosis, who documents her incredible improvement from secondary progressive multiple sclerosis using principles from a modified paleo diet, functional electrical stimulation, and other lifestyle changes. And if you want to see the entire context, you could watch the entire video by clicking the card above, but I'll show you the clip that Horn is referring to.
And it's just very difficult for me to get excited about one person's story, no matter how spectacular it is. I mean, how do we know that she didn't have an idiosyncratic, very good response to her program that the typical person would not experience? How do we know that the diagnosis of MS is even accurate? She describes her case in a somewhat unusual way, saying that she could have been diagnosed with idiopathic degeneration of the spinal cord until she had a positive spinal tap, kind of suggesting that maybe her brain MRI wasn't that typical of MS. I'm not saying she doesn't have MS, I have no idea, but it could be that her case is unique in some way, such that her experience wouldn't necessarily apply to you or me. It's just hard for me to get excited about one person's response.
Okay, so it's easy to see where I went wrong there, and I'll clarify what I really meant in a moment. And by the way, I don't intend this to be a critique of Rachel Horn. I think she was just trying to get across the point that anecdotes only mean so much, and we shouldn't take them so seriously. We should really look for high quality research. And believe me, I know that, Rachel Horn knows that, and I assure you Dr. Terry Wahls knows that, which is why she's trying to do further research. By the way, Rachel Horn is not the BBC presenter Rachel Horn. It's a different journalist. They just coincidentally have the same name. Let's avoid any confusion. Now, Dr. Terry Wahls and I have interacted somewhat since I made that video. I've interviewed her a few times on my channel, most recently to try to recruit patients into her randomized trial comparing her diet versus a ketogenic diet, which you should definitely check out. So she's trying to do further high quality research, and the ideal way to do research is a randomized controlled trial. Now, of course, we all understand that there is a lot of variability in people with multiple sclerosis, and one person's anecdote shouldn't really be that important. And that's really what I was trying to say. Just there's a lot of variability in neurological disease, especially multiple sclerosis. So for instance, I have patients who have very aggressive multiple sclerosis. At the time of diagnosis, even if they're relatively young, 20s and 30s, they could have a significant amount of permanent disability. Luckily, this is the minority of people. On the contrary, I have patients with very benign multiple sclerosis. One of my patients had optic neuritis at age 30. It was mild. She recovered, and she didn't have her second symptom of MS until age 67. And she was totally stable with not even subtle symptoms of cognitive problems or fatigue in the intervening period. So she had a 37-year remission, and she also had no real significant symptoms of MS until age 67. And even after that, she was doing very well. This is someone who has never taken disease-modifying therapy and does not keep any kind of special diet whatsoever. She is a former gymnast and is relatively fit, but definitely does not have a particularly healthy diet. And I have many patients who are older with long-standing MS, and I ask every single one of them about their lifestyle if they have low levels of disability, and there's really no clear pattern. Some have a typical American diet, some do follow a special diet, usually not that strictly, just because most older Americans aren't particularly strict with a specific diet, like whole foods plant-based diet or paleo diet or ketogenic diet. Most people who are older really aren't that strict. That's something that's become more popular amongst younger individuals, at least in my experience in South Los Angeles. Anyways, since that time, obviously I have talked to Dr. Terry Wahls. I've interviewed for her for a few YouTube videos. I spoke at one of her virtual seminars. Just to be clear, we don't have any kind of business relationship. There's no money being exchanged between the two of us. I did buy her book, so maybe she got a few dollars in commission, but I do generally support what she's trying to do, which is to do high quality research. Now, one thing that was said by Rachel Horn, if you read the Twitter thread, is she said, it's not really great for her to do the research because she's potentially biased. Obviously, she wants one side to win. She wants the modified paleo diet to win over the ketogenic diet, for instance, in this most recent trial. And I do generally agree with that. Ideally, the investigators would be as unbiased as possible. However, the question is, who exactly will do this research? How do you get money for this kind of research? There's no money in broccoli. It's hard to get NIH funding for this type of thing. She was able to get a private donor because of her popularity and because of how well she is respected in the community. So she's able to do this research because of who she is, specifically because she is potentially biased. Also, she takes great efforts to make sure the research itself is as unbiased as possible, where she is not analyzing the data. It's done by an independent statistician. And to say otherwise would essentially be to accuse her of fraud, which is totally unfounded. And when I look at her actual published studies, there's no sign that anything fishy is going on. And as is expected in most studies on nutrition, where you cannot 100% control what people eat, the data are a little bit washed out, and there isn't really a definitive overwhelming benefit to one treatment groups. We're looking for relatively small differences simply because there's no way to 100% make sure a certain treatment group follows a diet to perfection. But I think this is very meaningful research. I'd be interested to know, is the paleo diet going to perform better? Maybe the ketogenic diet will perform better. Maybe we'll get a surprise. So again, to clarify my statement, I'm not saying that anyone does or does not have a particular disease. I'm just saying there's a lot of variability in the disease, and one person's experience really does not mean that much. Believe me, I've had many patients who claim that their diet is the reason they're doing so well, but they all have different diets, and it's really, really difficult to say. There's a lot of individual variation. One other comment I want to make is about medical research in general, not necessarily specifically related to diet, but let's say related to MS. When something is published in a medical journal and you see a fancy chart or a fancy table, it looks very impressive and objective, and you tend to trust the data. And what you may not realize is you're still depending on the researchers to be accurate in the way that they report the data. For instance, it's well known that multiple sclerosis is fairly commonly misdiagnosed. One study at Cedars-Sinai and UCLA found that about 18% of people who were referred for an opinion about diagnosis actually had a different neurological disease. And I see this all the time. I see patients who have had multiple sclerosis for years and maybe have taken disease-modifying therapy and are doing well, but I don't really feel that they ever had the condition or they had something else. One of my patients, for instance, had a New York Times article written about them in the diagnosis column because they actually ended up having CADASIL, even though they were treated for multiple sclerosis for decades. This is a rare genetic condition that causes small strokes in the brain. Just one example. So you really can't trust researchers even 100%. So for example, there is a study that I'm working on currently with some of my colleagues at University of Melbourne, Professor George Jelinek, Steve Simpson, and we're looking at older people with multiple sclerosis, people with MS over age 55, and we want to see, are there lifestyle differences between people who have relatively low amounts of disability or who have higher amounts of disability? Are there differences in their diets, in their vitamin D supplementation or their vitamin D levels, their EBV exposure, their sunlight exposure, their physical exercise, whether they smoke or not? And the idea is, for younger people, most of them will have lower disability, but for older people or it's sort of more impressive for someone to have a relatively low amount of disability. And so we should look at those people more closely and see if there's something different about them. Is it just luck? Is their disease just less aggressive fundamentally for some reason? Or is there something about their lifestyle? Now, when I'm doing this research, I'm asking patients if they're willing to participate. But of course, I come across patients where I think the diagnosis is wrong or the diagnosis is unclear. And what am I doing? Simple. I'm excluding them from the study. I don't think it's appropriate to report that someone has benign multiple sclerosis in your research study if the diagnosis is erroneous or unclear in any way. I think we should really only look at people who have a clear, unambiguous diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. What does it even mean to say that someone has benign MS if they don't have typical lesions that look like multiple sclerosis? I don't think that would give us meaningful information and could potentially bias the study. But would I really trust other researchers to do the same thing, to really make sure they're including people who have a correct diagnosis of MS, or to include other relevant information accurately without bias? And my answer is, it depends who's doing the study. And so you really have to have this element of ethos, this trust in the researcher, if you're going to believe clinical research, particularly with something like diet, where there could be confounders. People could try to stack the deck with people who are believers in a certain diet and want a certain side to win. But anyway, hopefully I clarified things. Again, I was not trying to say that, Dr. Wahls does not have multiple sclerosis, just saying there's a lot of variability in people with MS. And believe me, Dr. Wahls is a very intelligent woman. She knows that, and that's the purpose of her doing this research. She wants to see, does her experience really apply to other people? And can she really prove it scientifically and not just speculate that it's true? And I think she's well on her way to working to that goal, and maybe she will prove it, and maybe she'll prove something unexpected. But either way, hopefully we'll learn something about nutrition and MS. And again, I'm not trying to criticize Rachel Horn. I think she was trying to make the exact same point that I was trying to make in my original video, which is don't rely too much on one anecdote. I see this all the time that, someone says, I have a relative with MS who had a really bad time taking this drug. I don't want to take that drug or do that diet. Or the opposite. I have a relative that, did really well, and maybe I should just do what they're doing. Or someone I met at a support group or someone in an online forum. I would suggest not relying too much on any one or few people because there's a lot of variability in people with multiple sclerosis, and someone else's experience isn't necessarily going to change your experience. Comments about Dr. Wahls, the Twitter thread if you want to look through it, or any suggestions for future videos below.